Hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf. In this video, I want to deal with misconceptions about Hegel's method. So I want to deal with the usual myths of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and maybe a couple more convoluted notions. I want to expand on why Hegel's method cannot be formalized, and why all these cheap formulations really don't help in the end. The first myth of the dialectic that anyone generally encounters is the myth of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis triad, which is the most generally popular conception of dialectics outside of philosophical scholarship focusing on Marx or Hegel. Under this conception of dialectics, one is told that the method of Hegel and Marx was to simply begin with a position, a thesis, then find and move on to the antithesis, its opposite, and finally to find the synthesis of both, which is a truer concept of position which brings both together in harmony. The problem with this conception of dialectics is not only that it doesn't make sense regarding Hegel or Marx, but also that it really is useless for thinking through anything except for liberal, centrist, idealist answers. Not only does this have no universal applicability, you can't reasonably apply this to everything, so it does not function well as a logical form, but it also fails to show why it's necessary. Let us see an example. Light, thesis, and dark, antithesis, are opposites. What is their synthesis? Gray? What does this mean? Nothing. Another one. Heterosexual thesis, homosexual antithesis, synthesized to bisexual. Is this useful for anything? Well, when it comes to politics, it's useful for centrists. Capitalism, thesis, and socialism, antithesis, synthesize into a much more preferable synthesis of social democracy. Not capitalism or socialism, but capitalism and socialism. How great it is, one must say, that the ultimate truth in reality is the centrist liberal dogma that the good answer to everything is a little bit of A and a little bit of B. The only thing this reasonably applies to is to human social decision-making. And the answer it gives every time is, well, a little bit of A, a little bit of B. It bolsters the idea that always we must give and take in social relations, despite the fact that we all know that there are certain things which don't work this way. You can't have a little bit of racism and a little bit of acceptance. You can't give rights to some and take rights from others while you do so. Doesn't make much sense and doesn't make for much of a logic. Therefore, to use this formulation for anything is useless. And if you look for it in Hegel's works, you also won't find it. But you might say, isn't the being, nothing, becoming dialectic an example of how useful this is? Isn't it thesis, antithesis, synthesis? Now, this is one of the few times in which this formulation actually fits, at least formally, to the results. Because being, nothing, and becoming are indeed, in the common understanding, in that kind of relation. Intuitively, it makes sense. But not quite. Why? Well, the reason being and nothing are opposed is not because we assumed they're opposites and because they happen to be opposites in the common understanding. Rather, it's just the way that we start bringing in terms for the content that we're investigating. Being is brought in because, well, the thought is. Nothing is brought in because the thought has no content. Becoming is brought in because being and nothing in being thought vanish. It's not because we already presuppose this form of thesis, antithesis, synthesis that it works out this way, but rather simply because that's how the content develops as we think it. Actually, in Chapter 1 of the Science of Logic, Hegel specifically notes why he doesn't use the concept of synthesis instead of sublation. Part of the problem is that synthesis implies a mere slapping together of terms. Nothing new is implied in the new term at all. Indeed, if becoming was a mere synthesis of being and nothing, we would only say that becoming is just this unity of being and nothing. But why should we simply slap being and nothing together? Why should this mean anything? Becoming is both being and nothing. And then what? If becoming becomes our new thesis, what is its antithesis? As a matter of fact, you'll see quite quickly that the whole thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing does not work right after becoming. Because what is the opposite of becoming? The opposite is determinate being, something you would never have thought about. And right after determinate being, the so-called synthesis does not follow. Right after determinate being, we talk about quality, we talk about reality and negation. So the supposed antithesis is something we couldn't have guessed from the get-go. We couldn't guess the synthesis either. Now, it seems as if this formula fits the being and nothing becoming dialectic. However, this is nonsense. Becoming is not the synthesis of being and nothing. Becoming includes within it being and nothing, but is itself more than the two concepts. It is a sublation. Sublations are not syntheses. that merely take a little bit of A and a little bit of B and mix them together. Sublations preserve the contradiction, the antithetical terms, and are themselves new terms that are more than the terms they contain. It is also not the case that Hegel came upon this triad of being by starting with being, finding its given opposite, and just putting the two concepts together in a third concept like one mixes vanilla and chocolate, and calls that vanillate. No new flavor has been made by bringing those two flavors together. It's just a mix. What Hegel actually does in this basic dialectic shall be shown later. Now, I would like to critique a particular Marxist work, Trotsky's ABCs of Materialist Dialectics, because it has a horrible interpretation of this method. It is, unfortunately, one of the commonly suggested introductions to dialectics for Marxists. Trotsky begins his explanation with a trite critique of the falsehood of formal logic by showing that A equals A is just an ideal abstraction, and that in material reality, A in fact does not equal A because things are always changing. This involves an example in which Trotsky puts forth the equation A equals A and says the second day is not the first day, materially speaking. It is not in the same spatial position, nor is it made of the same material carbon atoms that your pencil wrote out. If you are philosophically not well read and not prone to thinking through things, this seems like a pretty obvious criticism of formal logic. But it is a very weak criticism. The reason this criticism fails is this. An apple is still an apple, even if a couple molecules have rotted away on the ride from the grocery market to your home. The concept of the apple here is an abstraction, hence abstract thinking with general ideas work just fine for its practical purposes. When we talk in regular language, we do not seek to capture in the words we use the complete material description of an object, so his criticism of formal logic failing to capture the change of objects doesn't matter. In the ABCs of Materialist Dialectics, Trotsky invokes the famous laws of dialectics formulated by Engel in his Dialectics of Nature. What Trotsky's analysis of dialectics ultimately evolves to is this: that dialectics is merely the name of the acknowledgement that material reality is always becoming something else, and that abstract signifiers and concepts do not capture the complete detail of this becoming. That is, reality changes and our ideas must change with it. And, obviously, universality cannot capture individuality. This doctrine of endless change, becoming of reality, seems like a good thing to know, but Trotsky does not present it in any way that really proves the necessity of believing it. Trotsky's criticism of formal mathematical logic is a weak attempt to bolster a reputation for his own useless formulation of the logic he calls materialist dialectics. By attacking the universal abstract character of formal logic, Trotsky thought he was making an argument for his own logic, but he failed to attack formal logic in a way that proved its uselessness and unreality. Ironically, Trotsky's treatment of dialectics suffers from what he himself critiques in formal logic's rigidity. He freezes dialectics, kills its evolutionary spirit by invoking axioms and laws of dialectics as a formula to input information into, process, and spit out. The real value of the ABCs of Materialist Dialectics is Trotsky's points on the importance of historical context to understand anything, particularly the historical, political, and economic context of society. This understanding is one that does happen to be a product of dialectical thinking, but contextualism and historicism is not dialectics itself. Now let's turn to Engel's laws of dialectics. Engel was Marx's right-hand man and a brilliant analyst, but philosophy, particularly dialectical philosophy, was not his strength. Marx never talked about any laws of dialectics, nor did Hegel, who in fact in the very preface to his first major work, The Phenomenology of Spirit, denied the very possibility of formulating what his method was. The first law of dialectics, according to Engels, is the law of the transformation of quantity into quality. That quantitative changes led to qualitative changes was an observation not just in dialectical thinking and formal thinking, but also from simple empirical experience of the human species regarding certain phenomena. Things get hot and they burn. They get cold and they freeze and become brittle. An atom of water is not wet, but a couple billion are. An uprising in a city is a riot, and an uprising all over the state is a political revolution. Engels, inspired by Hegel's own quantity-quality measure dialectic, made a universalization of the dialectic relation between quantity and quality. However, what use does this law have for thinking other than the recognition that little things and activities piling up eventually lead to expected and unexpected changes in the natural and social sphere? If one were an observer of phenomena armed with this doctrine, what could one reason to? Not much. What about the second law, the law of the unity and conflict of opposites? This certainly arises as an understanding through dialectics, but it is not dialectics itself. The fact that being and nothing are innately connected is an elucidating piece of information to help understand how concepts function. And the fact that the working class and the capitalist class is innately connected is also a very elucidating piece of information that is vital to understanding why capitalism seems to be an unending conflict between rich and poor, trying to use the state to get what they want at the clear expense of the other. As a universal law of how to properly understand things, This doesn't help much. Indeed, one has to do a bit more analysis to show someone why it matters that workers cannot exist without capitalists, nor capitalists without workers. One can see the conflict as a unity, but can one see a solution by just knowing this? The Eastern mystical religions have this understanding of the unity of opposites as well. Good and evil, pleasure and pain, happiness and suffering. If you have one, you have the other. So what? Once again, to merely point to united opposites is not telling of very much. Finally, there is the law of the negation, a phrase that Hegel himself used regarding his concept of sublation. But while in Hegel this goes with the concept of true infinity, which finally closes in on itself completely and becomes absolute in a way, Engel demotes it to a bad infinity, a mere endless repetition of negations. This final law of dialectics affords no more an understanding to anyone looking from the outside as to why dialectics matters at all. As law states, any negation provides the ground for its own negation, or as Trotsky simply put it more concisely, material reality is always changing, always negating itself into something else. What use is the knowledge of these mystical metaphysical laws? Quantitative changes lead to qualitative changes, opposites are inherently tied together, all things negate themselves by their very nature. Putting the three laws together, no useful theory of logic can be put together to analyze anything of interest. Why should anyone care about dialectics if this is all it is? Well, lucky for us, it's not what it is. I'll touch up on one last formulation, and this one actually comes from Hegel himself in the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, and this is the formulation of abstract, negative, concrete. This, people tend to not understand, is not a method. It is a description of a beginning, an activity, and a conclusion of a method. This accurately describes how we begin with an abstract concept, negate this abstraction, and end with a concrete concept. Well, great. We have a form that we can look for, right? Well, so what? We may very well open a text, do a quick overview, and say, yep, this is Hegel. But so what? In doing so, we have not thought anything. We have not figured out how to think along with Hegel, how to do this ourselves. We may be able to recognize that someone is doing this, but we don't recognize what it is that they're doing. This is like looking at a programmer programming. You can see that they're obviously writing code, but you have no idea what that code actually is. So, do we have any right to say that we understand coding because we have seen that a coder codes and that code looks a certain way? Obviously not, and this is exactly how we should deal with Hegel's method in the same way. Just because we have some form that we can look at and say, yep, that's Hegel, we have not at all understood what Hegel's doing, why he's doing it, and why we should care. And this is why no formula will ever help you, because in simply seeing the shape, you have no idea what the content really is. And if you don't know what the content is, the shape is useless. And if the shape is useless, the form is useless. In the end, you don't have anything at all. In Hegel, what works is deal with content first, see the form later. It is far better for you to try to think thought by thought as it comes and how it's laid out by Hegel in any of his works, and then retroactively look at what you did in order to make sense of why it looks the way it does, and why this is no arbitrary method, why it is a necessary method with necessary content, which is not arbitrary or contingent itself. Now, I'll go over this whole deal about necessity in another video. Until then, this is Antonio Wolf. Thanks for listening.